if organisms can't respond to these changes, then they're likely to go extinct, many of them anyway. And that is because they're now maladapted for these new conditions. That is, they don't have traits that are well suited for those conditions. Their phenotypes, their traits don't match the conditions. There's a mismatch now. So this maladaptation will presumably make them have reduced survival, reduced reproductive success, and have population declines and cause extinction. Unless they can find a way to improve their adaptation to those local conditions. That is, adapt to those conditions or otherwise change their ranges or their positions or their behaviors so that they can actually do better under these new conditions. So how do we think about this process of maladaptation? So here's one representation of doing it, where you have a relationship between the phenotypes of the organisms, for example, breeding date or body size or any sort of external characteristic that's interacting with the environment, and fitness, that is the survival or reproductive success. And so this peak represents the best phenotype or the optimum phenotype. So if all else is equal, evolution and other forms of behavioral change or movement across the landscape should mean that you get the frequency distribution of phenotypes that sort of approximates the optimum of what the phenotype should be. Then the question is, what happens with environmental change? Well, you think about two different ways of this occurring. You think about like an abrupt shift in the optimum where the best breeding date or the best body size or the best physiology is going to all of a sudden jump to somewhere else through some sort of massive disturbance like a pollution event or habitat loss or something like that. Or alternatively, you can think about like sort of a gradually shifting best phenotype. So for example, one might imagine that as springs get warmer and warmer and the timing of the spring thaws are advancing, that organisms should shift their timing to start, coming out of torpor or hibernation, start breeding earlier, start leafing out earlier if you're a plant. And so you might have a gradual shift as a result of climate change, which is then followed, presumably, by a gradual shift in the organisms. So, for example, you have an abrupt shift in the optimum, the best trait is now somewhere different because of this pollution or habitat change or whatever. And that means that you have a gradient now in how different phenotypes do in this new condition, such that the larger phenotypes in this example do better than the smaller phenotypes, in which case you will have a shift and an evolution of the population through time toward the new optimum. So that's rapid evolution to the new optimum. If the optimum is gradually shifting away, such as through climate change or ocean acidification or something like that, then you would expect that the phenotypes will start tracking that and following behind it and hopefully keeping up with that change. How can organisms, if they don't go extinct, and to avoid extinction, how can they match their phenotypes to the environment, that is, reduce their maladaptation? One is if the local conditions are bad, you just get up and move somewhere else, move somewhere better. That's a good solution. And for example, organisms might shift their ranges northward or up the sides of mountains as things warm up. But if you can't shift, then another option is to inherently switch your phenotypes to the better condition, either through what's called plasticity, that is, through development or behavior, you just make a decision to change your phenotype to a new condition. So for example, if it's warmer this year, well, then you decide you're going to breed earlier this year. Or physiologically, you just start breeding earlier. So that's an individual plastic response to changed conditions. Or you evolve. That is, different individuals have different successes because of their different traits. And then the individuals with the better traits pass on those traits and genes to the next generation, which means that the next generation is then better adapted than the previous generation, and that population goes toward the new optimum. So we're going to talk about each of those things now in response to global climate change of various forms, global change of various forms. So in the introductory setup video, I talked about something called evolutionary traps and ecological traps, with the idea being that signals that evolved in the past to well suit at organisms for particular conditions were now bad. And so here are the official definitions of ecological trap and evolutionary trap. Now, those are just my own personal examples, but there are some really amazing examples of ecological and evolutionary traps. Here are some of them here. For example, there are a series of frogs and amphibians that like to eat lightning bugs, that is, bugs that produce light and therefore shine at night. And so they're eating Christmas lights because they think they're lightning bugs. Albatrosses that think plastic looks like fish food on the ocean, and so they eat too much plastic and their guts fill with plastic. Or various insects that breed in the wrong places, often because glass or pavement or something like that makes them think that it's water. So do you see this being reflected in population declines? Well, you do. And so here they're asking about, in a given place on the globe, what is the percentage of species in the ones they surveyed that are declining for land mammals? And you can see that there's a lot of decline in many of the different species across the range. So yes, it seems that there are many individual cues that we are now giving organisms that are bad for them, and as a result you seem to be seeing population level declines, where you're having declines of individual populations of any given species. Not all species are declining, but many are. If things are maladapted and they seem to be declining, is that increasing the extirpation of populations, that is, populations going away within a species, or extinctions of entire species? So Lonesome George over here was the last tortoise from the island of Pinta in Galapagos. And Lonesome George was the only tortoise left. And he was kept in the Charles Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos for many, many years, where they tried to find him a mate. So I took this picture of Lonesome George, and my kids got to see Lonesome George, but then, unfortunately, Lonesome George died. If you want to read more about Lonesome George and how they tried to get him to persist and survive, this is a pretty good book. Another just sort of interesting personal experience is the Labrador duck, which was found in Canada and several other northern countries, and is now extinct. And there's only something like 42 in collections anywhere in the globe. And one of them is outside my office in the Redpath Museum at McGill. That duck on the cover of this book called The Curse of the Labrador Duck is the duck that's outside my office. The red areas there show places where most of the surveyed species that are present are declining. Meaning that if you have a particular region of the globe and there used to be that species there used to be a population of that species there, now it's gone. Extinctions of entire species are also dramatically increasing in recent times. And here's one representation of that. So that's the bad stuff. So species, populations are disappearing, or becoming extirpated, and species are going extinct at increasing rates. Are organisms responding to these changes in ways that might better suit them for those changing conditions? So the first question we'd ask is, are species ranges changing? And so from my own personal experience, the most obvious thing here is that I did my graduate work on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And during that time, I never saw a turkey vulture. There just weren't any turkey vultures anywhere. And since then, I started doing research on Vancouver Island. I see turkey vultures everywhere. And so my impression is that all of a sudden turkey vultures have been spreading further north. And I searched around and found data that is indeed the case. These are Christmas bird counts that show that the number of turkey vultures is increasing dramatically in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, presumably associated with spreading north from climate change. But that's of course true very generically, and so here's one representation of the northward shift of a whole bunch of different aquatic organisms, marine organisms. I think the average shift northward over about a 20-year period or 24-year period is 19 miles further north. And of course there's high variation in this. Some things are shifting northward at a much higher rate than other things. You also see many examples of things shifting up on mountains. And so here are a bunch of different species here, and their normal latitudinal ranges. And then the green bars are range expansions, and the brown bars are range contractions. So things that are normally found at low elevations, you can see they're expanding their ranges upward in elevation, and things that were already at high elevations are contracting their lower elevation part of their range. So things, because of temperature, are shifting northward, or in the southern hemisphere, they're shifting southward, and they're also shifting up mountain ranges because of that increasing temperature. Are species traits also changing? I've been fishing for salmon at my cabin and steelhead, which are a form of salmonid salmon, since 1985. And of course that's sort of typical, old guy, in the old days everything was always bigger, but that's just been my impression. Now recently I became involved in a big meta-analysis of data for the size of salmon of many species in the Pacific Ocean through time. What we can ask, are salmon getting smaller? And what you see over here is for all of these different species, you see the trends in average body size through time. This is sort of the average trend across many, many, many different populations. And you see that basically everything is declining in body size, particularly strongly recently. Now, the shifts in body size from the early time period to the later time period are consistent across different regions of Alaska, and they range in value. Each one of these dots is a different population from, roughly 0, or for some populations it's increasing, to as much as a 20% decline in body size. We did a bunch of analyses to show this is primarily the result of changes in ocean conditions that are almost certainly driven by climate change. Now, it's not just the fish that are changing, but because so many things depend on salmon. Remember the previous thing I said where something like 30 million sockeye salmon are harvested every year in just one part of Alaska. These changes in body size could have major effects on the benefits that people receive from organisms and that ecosystems do. Because of the decline in body size, you will see a decline in the number of eggs that are being produced per salmon. You'll see a decline in the contribution of resources that salmon are bringing from the ocean into fresh water. So salmon get most of the resources in the ocean, and they bring back that nutrition and phosphorus and nitrogen back into fresh water, which then fertilizes and subsidizes freshwater, otherwise depauperate freshwater ecosystems and their food webs. The value for the fishermen is declining because of decreasing body size, and the number of meals per salmon is decreasing for indigenous people who are traditionally harvesting these salmon. As I said previously, that traits might change because of plasticity, that is, individual developmental or behavioral responses to changing conditions, or it might be because of evolution, that is, changes in gene frequency that are causing evolutionary changes in organisms. Now, this is where I tend to do a lot of work. Now, the first thing one might do is just use genetic data, like samples of gene frequencies in populations, to ask how much evolution is going on. So one thing we asked recently was how much is genetic diversity declining within populations? Genetic diversity is a good thing to have because it provides the potential for evolutionary response to environmental change. And we showed that by using long-term data records for genetic data. This is all the different samples we had. You can see declines in genetic diversity of on average 6%. And so this data is showing here, the 0 level would be no change through time in genetic diversity. And you can see that in the old samples in particular, you used to have a lot higher genetic diversity than you do in the present. So there's been a decline to the present, especially in the older samples. And these declines in genetic diversity from basically the 1800s into the present, into the 1900s, coincides with a major ramping up of environmental and industrial disturbances associated with the Industrial Revolution. What about changes in those same traits that we've been talking about, like body size or reproductive timing or something like that? Now, there are many examples where evolution is indeed showing changes as a result of climate change or hunting and harvesting or pollution or any of those disturbances I listed in the first part. And so here's one representation of that. These are red squirrels. I talked about red squirrels in the food web lecture as well. And what you see here is that the breeding date through 4 generations in the last 20 years is getting earlier. So that's a climate change associated shift. Things are breeding earlier, and it's genetic, and they know that because they can estimate these breeding values for these traits, which is the genetic component of the trait, using the pedigree data they have for the entire population through time. Also using breeding values, you can show that hunting and harvesting is having evolutionary effects as well. So in this case, there's a small mountain in Alberta where people do trophy hunting for bighorn sheep, and they can only kill a bighorn sheep if it shows a complete curl That is, the horn goes all the way around and then passes the eye. And if that's the case, they can shoot it, and then it's their trophy. But if it's less than that, they can't. So what that means is that hunters are strongly selecting against genes that cause fast growth of the horn and large horn size. And so you can see also then that the breeding values are decreasing. That is, the breeding values for horn size, the genetic component of horn size, whether they're genetically large horns or genetically small horns, the horns are becoming genetically smaller. So this is evolutionary change. And so sometimes evolution, phenotypic change, will save species from extinction, the evolutionary rescue. Other times it won't. And so we need to do a lot more research to understand when organisms are going to be able to respond to different forms of environmental change in different places and when they can't. And under the conditions where they can't, we need to try and figure out what we can do to help them out by reducing the disturbance and then by helping to promote their ability to evolve in response to that disturbance.